Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of flying, but no one believed a small-town girl from Texas could make it as a military pilot. Standing barely 5 feet tall with a soft voice that often got lost in crowded rooms, she didn't look like the tough fighter pilots everyone imagined. Her father worked at a local gas station, and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Flying seemed like an impossible dream for someone from her background. When Sarah first walked into the Air Force recruitment office, the sergeant behind the desk looked her up and down with obvious doubt. "You sure you're in the right place, miss?" he asked, not bothering to hide his skeptical tone. "The pilot program is pretty demanding. Maybe you'd be interested in communications or administration instead." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I want to be a pilot, sir. I've wanted it since I was 6 years old." She had practiced this moment in her mirror hundreds of times, knowing she'd face this exact reaction. The recruitment process was brutal. The deployment to Afghanistan came faster than Sarah expected. One day she was flying training missions over the Nevada desert, and the next she was boarding a transport plane bound for Bagram Airfield, carrying her gear and a head full of nervous anticipation. The reality of combat was finally here, and all her training would either prove sufficient or catastrophically inadequate. Bagram was unlike anything she had experienced. The base buzzed with constant activity as helicopters landed and took off, bringing wounded soldiers and supplies. The smell of diesel fuel and dust hung in the air, and the sound of distant explosions reminded everyone that this was a war zone. Sarah's sleeping quarters were a small metal container that felt like an oven during the day and an icebox at night. Her squadron commander in Afghanistan was Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, a veteran pilot who had flown combat missions for 15 years. When Sarah reported for duty, he looked tired and worn down by the endless cycle of missions and losses. The war had been going on for years, and everyone could feel the weight of it. "Welcome to the real world, Martinez," he said, studying her personnel file. "I've heard good things about your training, but this is different. Out there, people are trying to kill you for real, and if you make a mistake, you don't get to try again." Sarah's first few missions were reconnaissance flights, gathering intelligence on enemy positions while staying safely above the range of most ground fire. Flying over the Afghan mountains was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with peaks that seemed to reach up toward her aircraft and valleys that disappeared into shadow. During these early flights, Sarah began to understand why Afghanistan had defeated so many armies throughout history. The terrain provided countless hiding places for enemies, and the weather could change from clear skies to violent storms in minutes. Flying here required skills that no simulator could teach. Her first real combat mission came 3 weeks after arriving. Intelligence reports indicated that a group of enemy fighters had occupied a village in a remote valley and were using it as a base to attack supply convoys. Sarah's job was to provide air support for ground troops who would assault the position. As her F-16 screamed over the mountains toward the target area, Sarah felt her mouth go dry. This wasn't training anymore. Real soldiers were depending on her, and real enemies would be shooting back. The radio crackled with communications from the ground team as they moved into position. "Viper 1, this is Guardian 6, came the voice of the ground commander. "We're taking heavy fire from the ridge line. Can you see our position?" Sarah looked down at the chaos below. Smoke was rising from several buildings, and she could see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons. Her training kicked in automatically as she identified targets and calculated attack runs. But this time, the explosions would be real, and people would die. Her first bombing run was textbook perfect. The guided munitions struck their targets with precision that cleared the way for the ground troops to advance. But as she circled for another pass, enemy anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Tracers streaked past her cockpit like deadly fireworks, and Sarah realized that people were actively trying to kill her. The mission was successful, but Sarah felt shaken afterward. She had performed well under fire, but the reality of combat was more intense than anything she had imagined. That night, she lay in her bunk listening to distant artillery and wondering if she was really cut out for this kind of work. Her doubts didn't last long. Over the next few months, Sarah flew mission after mission, providing air support for ground troops, attacking enemy supply lines, and protecting humanitarian convoys. With each flight, she became more confident and more deadly. Her flying skills, which had been impressive in training, became legendary in combat. Other pilots began requesting her for difficult missions. Her ability to deliver precision strikes in complex terrain made her invaluable for operations where collateral damage had to be minimized. Ground commanders specifically asked for that little pilot who never misses when they needed close air support. But Sarah's defining moment came during a mission that would make her famous throughout the military. Intelligence had located a high-value enemy leader who was meeting with his commanders in a fortified compound deep in the mountains. The mission required multiple aircraft working together to destroy the target while avoiding civilian casualties in a nearby village. Sarah was assigned as the lead pilot for the mission, something that would have been unthinkable when she first arrived. As her four-plane formation approached the target area, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The compound was isolated, the weather was clear, and satellite imagery showed the target vehicles in position. But as they began their attack run, the situation exploded into chaos. The enemy had been expecting them, and the entire valley erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Missiles streaked up from hidden positions, and the sky filled with deadly metal. Sarah watched in horror as one of her wingmen was hit, his aircraft spinning out of control before the pilot managed to eject. "This is a trap," came the panicked voice over the radio. They knew we were coming. The mission commander ordered an abort, but Sarah could see ground troops in the valley below who were pinned down by enemy fire. If her formation retreated, those soldiers would be slaughtered. In that moment, she made a decision that would define her career. "Negative on the abort," Sarah said into her radio, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "I'm going in." What happened next became the stuff of legend. Instead of the planned high-altitude bombing run, Sarah dropped her aircraft to treetop level and screamed into the valley at maximum speed. Anti-aircraft guns swiveled to track her, but she was moving too fast and too low for them to get a clear shot. Her 20mm cannon opened fire, and the distinctive sound of her guns echoed off the mountain walls. Sarah's aircraft carried 4,000 rounds of ammunition, and she intended to use every single one. Flying patterns that seemed impossible to observers on the ground, she systematically destroyed every enemy position she could find. The enemy had never faced anything like Sarah's assault. Her aircraft danced between the mountains like a deadly hummingbird, appearing from unexpected angles and disappearing before return fire could be effective. She used the terrain like a shield, popping up from behind ridges to attack before vanishing again. For 20 minutes, Sarah single-handedly turned the battle. Her cannon fire destroyed anti-aircraft positions, eliminated sniper nests, and broke up enemy formations that had been advancing on trapped ground troops. She flew so close to the ground that her aircraft's exhaust set grass fires, and so close to enemy positions that soldiers could see her face through the cockpit glass. When her ammunition was finally exhausted, the battlefield had been transformed. Every major enemy position was either destroyed or abandoned, and the surviving fighters were retreating deeper into the mountains. The ground troops that had been trapped were now advancing, secured by Sarah's devastating attack. Back at base, the debriefing was unlike anything anyone had experienced. Gun camera footage showed maneuvers that flight instructors said were theoretically impossible. Sarah had flown through valleys so narrow that her wingtips had less than 50 feet of clearance on each side, all while under heavy fire and at speeds approaching the sound barrier. "How did you do that?" Colonel Brooks asked, studying the tactical display in amazement. "How did you fly through that canyon system without hitting anything?" Sarah thought about it for a moment. "I guess I just saw where I needed to go," she said simply. "The aircraft wanted to follow the valleys, so I let it." News of Sarah's mission spread throughout the military faster than wildfire. The girl who had been doubted at every step of her career had just pulled off one of the most spectacular combat flying performances in modern history. Military analysts would study the footage for years, trying to understand how one pilot had achieved so much with conventional weapons. Awards and commendations followed, but Sarah was more interested in the letters she received from ground troops whose lives she had saved. Soldiers wrote to thank the angel pilot, who had appeared when all seemed lost. Some included photos of their families, explaining that they wouldn't be coming home without her intervention. The mission changed how everyone saw Sarah, but, more importantly, it changed how she saw herself. The girl who had been told she was too small, too weak, and too different had proven that heroism comes from the heart, not from fitting other people's expectations. She had found her place in the world, and it was in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When Sarah's deployment ended, she returned to the United States as a decorated war hero. The journey from doubted cadet to combat legend was complete, but she knew it was really just the beginning. Her story would inspire countless others who had been told they weren't good enough, weren't strong enough, or didn't fit the mold. Years later, when young pilots asked her for advice, Sarah would tell them about the power of proving people wrong. She would explain that every doubt, every skeptical look, every suggestion that they didn't belong was actually fuel for their determination. The girl from Texas who had dreamed of flying had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from being what people expect, but from being exactly what they don't. Sarah Martinez had changed the battlefield with 4,000 rounds of ammunition, but she had changed herself with something even more powerful: the absolute refusal to accept other people's limitations. Her legacy wasn't just in the enemies she defeated or the lives she saved, but in proving that heroes really do come in all sizes, and that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones nobody sees coming. Nevada desert stretched endlessly in every direction as Sarah arrived at Nellis Air Force Base, home to the most intense fighter pilot training program in the world. The heat hit her like a physical blow when she stepped off the transport plane, and the landscape looked like something from another planet. This would be her home for the next year, where she would either become a combat pilot or wash out like so many before her. Her new squadron commander, Colonel Harrison, was a legend among military pilots. He had flown missions in 3 different wars and had a reputation for being impossibly demanding. When Sarah reported for duty, he looked her over with the same skeptical expression she had grown used to. "So you're the one everyone's talking about," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've heard you can fly, Martinez, but flying and fighting are 2 very different things. Out there, it's not about perfect landings or smooth takeoffs. It's about staying alive when someone is trying to kill you." The other pilots in her class were the best of the best from around the country. They had all graduated at the top of their flight schools, and they all shared the same confidence that came from years of being told they were exceptional. Sarah could feel their eyes on her during the first briefing, measuring her, wondering if the stories they had heard were true. Her aircraft was an F-16 Fighting Falcon, one of the most advanced fighter jets ever built. The first time Sarah saw her assigned plane, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. This wasn't a training aircraft with safety features and instructors. This was a weapon designed for war, capable of speeds that could tear a human body apart if something went wrong. The transition from training aircraft to fighter jets was brutal. The F-16 was incredibly sensitive to pilot input, responding to the slightest touch like a thoroughbred horse. Many new pilots overcorrected, causing their aircraft to jerk and bounce through the sky. Sarah's first flights were rough, and she could hear frustration in her instructor's voice through the radio. "Martinez, you're fighting the aircraft," Major Peterson said during one particularly difficult training session. "This isn't a bus you're driving. You need to become part of the machine." But Sarah had always been a quick learner. She spent hours studying every system, every button, every switch until she could operate them blindfolded. While other pilots relaxed in the evenings, she was in the simulator, practicing emergency procedures until they became instinctive. Her small size, which had always been seen as a disadvantage, actually helped her fit better in the cramped cockpit than larger pilots. The real test came during air-to-air combat training. This was what separated real fighter pilots from those who just knew how to fly. Sarah would face off against experienced instructors in aerial dogfights, trying to lock onto them with simulated weapons while they did everything possible to shoot her down first. Her first combat mission was against Captain Reynolds, a pilot known for destroying the confidence of new students. As they circled each other in the Nevada sky, Sarah felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might interfere with her radio communications. This wasn't like the controlled exercises she was used to. This felt real and dangerous, "All right, rookie," Captain Reynolds said through the radio, his voice calm and confident. "Let's see what you're made of." The fight began, and Sarah immediately found herself in trouble. Captain Reynolds was everywhere at once, appearing behind her when she thought she had lost him, disappearing when she tried to line up a shot. Within minutes, she heard the dreaded tone that meant she had been killed by simulated missiles. "Better luck next time, Martinez," Reynolds said as they headed back to base. "Maybe stick to cargo planes." But Sarah didn't give up. That night, she studied gun camera footage from the day's flights, analyzing every mistake she had made. She talked to maintenance crews about aircraft performance, learning things about her plane that weren't in any manual. She practiced visualization techniques, imagining aerial combat scenarios until she could see them clearly in her mind. The next day brought another chance. This time, Sarah lasted longer before being shot down, and she even managed to get a brief lock on her opponent. The day after that was better still. Slowly, gradually, she began to understand the deadly dance of aerial combat. Her breakthrough came during a particularly challenging exercise. Sarah was outnumbered 3-1, facing off against instructor pilots who were trying to overwhelm her with multiple attacks from different directions. Instead of panicking, something clicked in her mind. She began to see the battle differently, not as separate opponents, but as a puzzle to be solved. Using the F-16's superior maneuverability, Sarah dove low and used the desert terrain to break up the enemy formation. When one instructor followed her down, she pulled into a climb so sharp that her vision grayed out from the G-forces. But she held on, and when her vision cleared, she had a perfect shot. The simulated missile tone sounded, indicating a successful hit. Through her headset, she heard surprised voices from the other pilots. "Where did she go?" one asked. "How did she get behind me?" But Sarah wasn't done. Using tactics she had improvised on the spot, she managed to evade the other two instructors long enough to set up another attack. By the end of the exercise, she had shot down 2 of the 3 planes sent against her, something no student had ever accomplished in that particular scenario. Back on the ground, the debriefing was unlike any she had experienced. The instructors gathered around the tactical display, replaying her maneuvers with obvious interest. Captain Reynolds, who had been her harshest critic, shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like that," he admitted. "Where did you learn those tactics?" "I didn't learn them anywhere," Sarah replied honestly. "I just saw an opportunity and took it." Word of her performance spread quickly through the base. Other pilots began approaching her with respect rather than skepticism. During training exercises, they started asking for her opinion on tactics and strategy. Sarah realized she wasn't just learning to fly fighters. She was learning to think like a warrior. But her newfound success brought new challenges. Some pilots became resentful, claiming she was getting special treatment or that her victories were just luck. A few instructors seemed determined to knock her down a peg, assigning her the most difficult training scenarios they could devise. The pressure intensified during weapons training. Sarah learned to fire missiles and drop bombs with precision that amazed her instructors. Her small hands, which had once been seen as a weakness, allowed her to operate complex weapons systems with delicate accuracy. She could thread missiles through incredibly narrow windows of opportunity that larger pilots might miss. During one memorable exercise, Sarah was assigned to destroy a simulated enemy radar installation hidden in a mountain valley. The approach required flying at extremely low altitude through winding canyons while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missiles. Many pilots had failed this particular mission, some crashing their aircraft in the simulator when they flew too low or too fast. Sarah studied the terrain for hours, memorizing every ridge and valley. When the mission began, she skimmed over the desert floor so low that her aircraft's shadow merged with the ground. She twisted through the canyons like a river following its course, making turns so precise that her wingtips seemed to brush the rock walls. The target appeared ahead, nestled in a valley surrounded by defensive positions. Sarah climbed suddenly, popping up just long enough to release her simulated bombs before diving back down below the radar coverage. The exercise ended with a perfect hit on the target and 0 damage to her aircraft. Colonel Harrison watched the replay footage with obvious amazement. "Martinez," he said finally, "I think we might have underestimated you." But Sarah knew this was just training. Real combat would be different. with real enemies who shot back with real bullets. The thought both terrified and excited her. She had proven she could fly and fight, but soon she would face the ultimate test. Orders were coming down for combat deployments, and Sarah's name was on the list. As she prepared for her final training exercises, Sarah reflected on how far she had come. The girl who had been told she was too small and too weak was now one of the most skilled fighter pilots in her class. She had learned to turn doubt into determination and skepticism into strength. The Nevada desert had been her forge, shaping her from a promising student into a deadly weapon. Soon, she would find out if all her training had been enough to prepare her for real war. The small-town girl from Texas was about to become something the world had never seen before, a combat pilot ready to prove that heroes come in all sizes. Her journey from doubt to confidence was nearly complete, but the most important chapter was still ahead. Sarah Martinez was ready for war, and war was coming whether she felt ready or not. During the physical fitness tests, male candidates would smirk when they saw her struggling with pull-ups. She could hear their whispered comments about how she'd never make it through basic training, let alone flight school. Some instructors seemed to agree, pushing her harder than the others, waiting for her to quit. But Sarah had something most people couldn't see. Growing up poor had taught her how to fight for everything she wanted. When other kids got new bikes for Christmas, she saved money from babysitting for 2 years to buy a used one. When her high school didn't have a proper physics program, she taught herself from library books because she knew pilots needed to understand how things fly. Flight school was even worse than she expected. The academic pressure was intense, with complex mathematics and physics that made her head spin. She studied while others slept, often falling asleep over textbooks in the library. Her roommate would find her at 3 in the morning, still working through flight manual diagrams by flashlight. The real challenge came during actual flight training. The first time Sarah climbed into a training aircraft, her hands shook so badly she could barely grip the controls. The instructor, Captain Williams, was known for washing out students who couldn't handle the pressure. He sat beside her with his arms crossed, waiting for her to mess up. "All right, Martinez," he said in a bored tone. "Show me you can at least get this thing off the ground without killing us both." Sarah took a deep breath and went through her pre-flight checklist. She had memorized every step, every switch, every gauge. As the engine roared to life, something changed inside her. All the doubt, all the whispered comments, all the skeptical looks faded away. This was where she belonged. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky, and for the first time in months, Sarah smiled. Flying felt natural, like she had been born to do it. But when they landed, Captain Williams just grunted and made notes on his clipboard. "Barely acceptable," was all he said. Week after week, Sarah performed well in the air, but the comments from instructors remained harsh. "She's too small to handle combat situations," one said during an evaluation meeting she wasn't supposed to hear. "What happens if she needs to eject? She doesn't have the physical strength." Other students began to notice her skills, though. During formation flying exercises, Sarah had an almost supernatural ability to maintain perfect position. Her aircraft seemed glued to the lead plane, never wavering even in rough weather. During emergency simulation drills, she made quick, smart decisions that impressed even her harshest critics. But respect was slow to come. Male students who had initially dismissed her began asking for her help with difficult maneuvers. She noticed them watching her technique during landing practice, trying to figure out how someone so small could handle the controls with such precision. The breaking point came during night flying training. Night flights were considered the most dangerous part of pilot education, and several students had already washed out after making critical errors in the darkness. Sarah's turn came on a particularly challenging evening with low clouds and strong crosswinds. As she prepared for takeoff, she overheard 2 instructors talking near the aircraft. "This weather is too much for her," one said. "We should postpone her flight." "No," Captain Williams replied. "If she can't handle this, she doesn't belong here." Sarah's heart pounded as she taxied to the runway. The wind rocked her small aircraft, and rain began spattering the windscreen. Through her headset, she heard air traffic control warning about deteriorating conditions. This was her moment of truth. The takeoff was rough, with the plane bouncing and shaking as it climbed through the turbulent air. But Sarah kept her focus, making tiny adjustments to keep the aircraft stable. Once above the clouds, she found herself in a peaceful world of stars and moonlight, far from the storm below. The real test came during landing. Approaching the runway in gusty crosswinds required skills that many experienced pilots found challenging. Sarah lined up for her approach, feeling the wind trying to push her aircraft sideways. She made constant corrections, her hands moving smoothly on the controls as if she had been flying for years instead of months. The landing was perfect. The plane touched down exactly on centerline despite the difficult conditions. As Sarah taxied back to the hangar, she saw ground crew members giving her thumbs-up signs. Even Captain Williams looked surprised. But the celebration was short-lived. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Sarah had been selected for advanced fighter training, but she overheard conversations in the hallway about her assignment. "They're just trying to fill diversity quotas," one instructor said. "She'll never see real combat." Sarah realized that no matter how well she flew, many people would always see her as a token, a feel-good story rather than a real pilot. The thought made her angry, but it also made her more determined. She would prove them wrong, no matter what it took. Her advanced training assignment would take her to Nevada, where she would learn to fly the most sophisticated fighter aircraft in the world. The training was designed to weed out all but the most exceptional pilots. Sarah packed her few belongings, knowing she was heading into an even bigger challenge. As her bus pulled away from the flight school, Sarah looked back at the place where she had fought so hard to prove herself. She had survived the first test, but she knew the real battles were still ahead. The small-town girl who had been told she was too weak, too small, and too different was about to enter a world where only the strongest survived. The doubt in people's eyes had become fuel for her determination. Every skeptical look, every whispered comment about her abilities, every suggestion that she didn't belong had made her work harder. She carried those memories with her like ammunition, ready to use them when the real fighting began. Her journey to become a combat pilot was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez was ready for whatever came next. She had learned that sometimes the greatest weapon a person can have is the determination to prove everyone wrong. The girl who had been doubted was about to become someone no one would ever underestimate again.